The office building stood tall in the middle of the city, glass walls shining under the morning sun. Inside, hundreds of employees worked hard every day, each of them carrying the weight of deadlines, targets, and the fear of being called out. By one man, the CEO. He was known not only as the head of the company, but also as the most feared presence in the entire building. His name was Richard Collins, a man in his late 40s who wore sharp suits, expensive watches, and carried himself as if he owned not just the company, but the people working inside it. Richard believed he was better than everyone else, he thought, of himself as smarter, stronger, and more deserving of respect simply because he had reached the top. In his mind, those beneath him, his assistants, clerks, and especially janitors, were unimportant. To him, they were just background figures, existing only to serve. Whenever he walked through the hallways, he never greeted anyone. Instead, he would give sharp looks, as if reminding everyone that they worked under his command. Employees whispered about his arrogance during lunch breaks. He was the type of man who loved to show power. If someone made even a small mistake, like sending an email a minute late or misplacing a file, Richard would call them out in front of the entire team. He believed fear kept people in line. Kindness, in his eyes, was a weakness. Some workers even said he enjoyed watching others squirm under his sharp words, almost like it gave him energy. One of Richard's favorite things was to remind people of his wealth. He would casually mention the cost of his new car, the price of the suit he wore, or the luxury vacations he took with his family. He always made sure others knew that his lifestyle was far above theirs. It wasn't just arrogance. It was as if he wanted everyone to feel small compared to him. Even the senior managers were careful around him. They prepared their presentations with extra care, checking each slide 3 or 4 times, afraid that Richard would explode over the smallest error. And when he did explode, it was not just anger, it was humiliation. He would laugh sarcastically, raise his voice, and say things that made people doubt their own worth. Many employees had cried in the restroom after meetings with him, but Richard never cared. For him, it was all about control. In this office full of stress and silence, one man stood out not because of power or wealth, but because of his simplicity. The janitor, Mr. Harris, moved quietly through the building every day. He cleaned the floors, emptied the bins, and fixed broken things. He didn't speak much, but he always had a gentle smile for those who acknowledged him. To Richard, however, Mr. Harris was invisible. He never once said good morning or thank you. In Richard's world, janitors were at the very bottom, almost not worth noticing. One morning, Richard walked into the office earlier than usual. His shoes clicked loudly against the polished marble floor, and he frowned when he noticed a small water spill near the reception desk. It was barely visible, but to him, it was unacceptable. He looked around and saw Mr. Harris wiping down a nearby table. Instead of calmly asking him to clean the spill, Richard's arrogance took over. His voice rose, echoing across the lobby as he barked, "What kind of useless work is this? Do you even know how to do your job?" The few employees standing nearby froze in silence. They had seen Richard scold people before, but there was something especially cruel about the way he spoke to the janitor. Harris looked up, surprised but calm, and began walking toward the spill to clean it. But Richard wasn't done. He continued to lecture him loudly, saying things like, "I don't pay people to stand around. And this is why discipline is needed in this company." His words were sharp, dripping with arrogance, as if a simple water spill had threatened the entire reputation of the company. What Richard didn't realize was that his behavior showed more about himself than about the janitor. His arrogance was like a mask he wore every day, hiding his insecurity and need for control. But to the employees watching, it was just another example of his cruelty. They exchanged quiet looks, feeling sorry for Mr. Harris, yet too afraid to speak up. No one wanted to be the next target of Richard's temper. For Richard, the humiliation of others was a performance. Every raised voice, every insult, was a reminder that he was in charge. He thrived on the silence that followed his outbursts. To him, silence meant fear, and fear meant power. And as long as he held that power, he believed nothing could shake him. Little did he know, the man he had just shouted at was not ordinary. Behind the humble uniform and quiet nature, Mr. Harris carried a past full of bravery, discipline, and strength, a past Richard would soon regret underestimating. Mr. Harris was a man most people barely noticed, yet he noticed everything. He arrived at the office before the sun had fully risen, always carrying the same worn-out lunchbox and a thermos of coffee. His uniform was simple, neatly pressed though. Old, and his shoes were polished as if he still lived by some inner code of discipline. At first glance, he looked like any ordinary janitor, the kind of man people passed by without even realizing he was there. But those who bothered to watch closely could see there was something different about him. He moved with purpose, each step steady and controlled, like a man who had spent years learning how to act with precision. When he mopped the floor, it wasn't just cleaning, it was careful, calculated, almost like a routine he had memorized 1,000 times before. When he carried trash bags or fixed a broken chair, he did it without complaint, without hesitation. He never cut corners, even when nobody was watching. Most employees thought of him as the quiet janitor. He spoke very little, usually answering with a polite, "Yes, sir," "No, ma'am," or a small nod. But when he did smile, it was warm and genuine, the kind of smile that carried kindness without words. He never bragged, never drew attention to himself, and never seemed angry even when the CEO barked insults at him. Instead, he responded with calmness, as if no insult could touch his dignity. Harris was in his late 50s, though his posture and movements made him seem younger. His back was straight, his eyes sharp, and his grip strong, even though his hands showed the roughness of hard labor. The younger employees often wondered why a man like him, who seemed so disciplined, would settle for a janitor's job. But no one asked. People assumed he was just another man trying to make ends meet, perhaps unlucky in life. The truth was far deeper. Harris had lived a life most could never imagine. Decades ago, he had served in the Special Forces, carrying out missions that demanded courage, intelligence, and sacrifice. He had trained in the harshest conditions, faced enemies stronger and more ruthless than any arrogant CEO, and endured situations where one mistake could cost lives. But he never spoke about it. To him, those years belonged to another lifetime, one he had quietly locked away. Now, he chose a quieter path. Cleaning floors and fixing light bulbs might have seemed small compared to his past. But Harris treated it with the same honor he once gave to his military duties. Work was work, and he believed every task deserved respect. If others looked down on him, he didn't mind. He knew who he was, and he didn't need anyone else's approval. Employees often saw him helping in ways beyond his job description. If someone dropped papers in the hallway, Harris would kneel down to pick them up. If the printer jammed, he would fix it before anyone called IT. Once, a young intern came to work on a stormy day, drenched and shivering because she had forgotten an umbrella. Harris, without hesitation, gave her his own jacket, then continued his shift in the cold air without complaint. These small acts made some people quietly admire him, though they never voiced it aloud. What most didn't know was how observant he was. Harris noticed things others missed: a worker staying late and looking stressed, a manager hiding frustration after a tough meeting, or a secretary fighting tears while answering phone calls. He didn't interfere, but his sharp eyes always caught the unspoken struggles around him. His years in the military had taught him to read people, to see beyond words, and he carried that skill into his quiet life as a janitor. Despite his calm nature, Harris wasn't a man who accepted disrespect easily. He simply chose his battles. The CEO's arrogance, the insults. The shouting, those things didn't shake him because he had endured far worse in his past. Compared to life-or-death missions, Richard's tantrums were nothing more than noise. Harris had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something others gave. It was something a man carried within himself. There were times, though, when people caught a glimpse of the strength hidden beneath his quiet surface. Once, a heavy cabinet began tipping over while 2 employees tried to move it. Harris rushed forward, grabbed the falling side with surprising speed, and held it upright with one hand until they regained control. The employees were stunned. How could a man his age have that kind of strength? He just smiled, said nothing, and went back to work another time during a late evening shift. A worker who had stayed behind to finish a project was harassed by a drunk man who had wandered in from outside. Before anyone could react, Harris stepped in. His movements were quick, sharp, controlled. Within seconds, the man was disarmed and escorted out, leaving the worker safe and shaken. When asked how he had managed it, Harris simply shrugged and said old habits. These moments hinted at his past, but he never explained further. For Harris, it wasn't about showing off. It was about being useful, about protecting people quietly without expecting praise. Still, the CEO, Richard Collins, never saw any of this. To him, Harris was just another janitor, someone invisible, someone replaceable. Richard's arrogance blinded him from seeing the truth that others quietly suspected, that Harris was no ordinary man. And while Harris continued his humble work day after day, the clash between his quiet dignity and the CEO's loud arrogance was growing. A storm was building inside that office, and soon everyone would see the truth behind the humble janitor's silence. The morning began like any other. The office lobby buzzed with the sound of ringing phones, clicking keyboards, and hurried footsteps. Employees walked quickly to their desks, some holding coffee, others balancing files and laptops. Everyone was focused on starting the day right because, in this office, mistakes were dangerous. When the CEO was around, even a small error could become a big problem. Richard Collins arrived later than usual that day. And as always, his presence was felt before he even said a word. His shiny black car pulled up at the entrance, the driver opening the door with a nervous bow. Richard stepped out in a perfectly tailored suit, his gold watch gleaming under the sunlight. He walked through the lobby with a cold, sharp expression, scanning the room as though he was checking for flaws in both the building and the people inside it. Employees lowered their eyes when he passed, afraid to make eye contact. On the far side of the lobby, Mr. Harris was busy mopping near the glass doors. His movements were steady and calm, the mop gliding across the tiles in neat strokes. To him, it was just another day of keeping the workplace clean. But to Richard, it was another chance to show dominance, just a few steps away from Richard's path. A small spill of coffee had been left unattended. An employee rushing to a meeting had accidentally dropped it, planning to come back later to clean it. But Richard noticed it immediately. His eyes narrowed, and his face twisted with disgust. He stopped walking and pointed dramatically at the small puddle, his voice booming across the lobby. "What is this?" The sudden outburst made everyone freeze. Heads turned toward the CEO, then toward the floor, and finally toward Mr. Harris, who was only a few feet away. Harris calmly turned his head, saw the spill, and began walking over with his mop. To him, it was nothing unusual. Spills happened all the time, and cleaning them was simply part of his job. But Richard wasn't done. His voice rose louder, echoing against the marble walls. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Useless, careless work. Do you even bother to look around? Or do you just stand there waiting for me to point things out?" So the employees standing nearby glanced at each other. Nervously, They had all seen this before Richard turning a minor issue into a public humiliation. Some wanted to speak up, but fear sealed their lips. Nobody dared to defend the janitor. Harris stopped by the spill and began to mop it up silently, his face calm, his hands steady. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look directly at Richard. To him, shouting was just noise, nothing more. But to Richard, the janitor's calmness felt like defiance. "You think this is acceptable?" Richard barked, taking a step closer. "You've been here how long? And still, this is the quality of your work. I don't run a charity. I don't pay people to stand around doing nothing." Harris finished mopping the last of the spill, wrung the mop out in the bucket, and gave a polite nod. His silence seemed respectful, but in truth, it was strength. He had dealt with far worse voices than Richard's. Screams on battlefields. Orders barked under gunfire. The chaos of life or death missions. Richard's anger was nothing compared to that. But Richard didn't know. He only saw a janitor who, in his eyes, looked weak. His arrogance pushed him further, and he wanted to crush this man in front of everyone. The lobby was now completely silent. Every eye was on the CEO and the janitor. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Richard snapped, his voice sharp as a whip. Harris raised his eyes for a moment. His calm gaze met Richard's furious one. It wasn't the gaze of a frightened employee. It was steady, unshaken, almost too steady. For the briefest second, Richard felt something he couldn't explain. It was as if the janitor's eyes carried a weight, a history, a quiet authority that clashed with his own arrogance. But Richard quickly brushed it off. He smirked and shook his head. "Pathetic," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then, with a wave of his hand, he added, "You're done here. Get your things and leave. I don't keep lazy people on my payroll." Gasps spread quietly. Through the crowd, employees looked at one another in disbelief, firing a man on the spot for a small coffee spill. Even for Richard, this seemed extreme. But nobody dared to object. Harris stood silently for a moment. He didn't beg, didn't argue, didn't even frown. He simply nodded once, as if accepting the decision, and walked back toward the janitor's closet to put away his mop. His calmness was unsettling. People expected anger or pleading, but instead, Harris's quiet dignity filled the air. Richard, satisfied with his display of power, straightened his suit and looked around the lobby. "Let this be a reminder," he declared, "that I expect excellence at all times. Nothing less." Then he walked off toward the elevators, leaving a heavy silence behind. As the doors closed, employees whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads in pity for Harris, others in anger at Richard. They had all known the CEO was arrogant, but today he had crossed a line. Meanwhile, Harris packed his cleaning supplies slowly, his movements calm, his face unreadable. Deep inside, he wasn't broken by Richard's words. He'd faced real battles, real enemies. Losing a janitor's job was nothing compared to what he had already survived. Still, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sadness, not for himself, but for the kind of man Richard had become. Little did Richard know, the storm he had just created would come back to him in ways he could never imagine, because Harris was not just a janitor. He was a man forged in the fires of discipline, honor, and survival, a retired Special Forces operative who carried more strength in his silence than Richard carried in all his wealth and arrogance. The lobby remained unnaturally quiet, even after the CEO stormed off toward the elevators. It felt like the air itself was heavy, pressing down on the employees who had just witnessed what happened. The sound of Richard's expensive shoes clicking against the marble had faded, but his words, sharp, humiliating, final, still echoed in everyone's ears. "You're done here. Get your things and leave." Mr. Harris moved slowly, as if unaffected by the storm that had just swept through the room. He wheeled his cleaning cart back toward the storage closet, every step calm, every motion controlled. He didn't slam the mop into the bucket, didn't mutter under his breath, didn't show the anger many assumed he must feel. To the people watching, this composure was confusing. A man had just been fired, humiliated in front of everyone, yet he carried himself with quiet dignity, as though he was still in charge of himself, even if he was no longer in charge of his job. Some of the younger employees exchanged worried glances. A few whispered softly, "He didn't deserve that." One woman near the reception desk clenched her fists, her face red with anger. But she didn't speak. Nobody spoke. They all knew what would happen if anyone dared to defend the janitor. They would be the next target of Richard's fury. In this office, silence was survival. Inside the janitor's closet, Harris neatly placed the mop back in its corner. He folded a cleaning rag with care, as though it mattered to leave everything in order, even though he had just been told to leave forever. His actions were slow, thoughtful. To him, order was a habit, a way of life, even in the face of injustice. Discipline guided his hands. Meanwhile, upstairs, Richa entered his office with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had proved his authority. He leaned back in his leather chair, poured himself a glass of water, and smirked as he replayed the scene in his mind. To him, firing Harris wasn't just about a coffee spill, was about reminding everyone who held the power. There was his tool, and he believed he had just sharpened it. But what Richard failed to realize was that power built on fear was fragile. Downstairs, the employees' loyalty wasn't growing stronger, was breaking apart. For many of them, watching Harris get fired wasn't just uncomfortable. It was eye-opening. They had seen plenty of Richard's arrogance before. Pa today had crossed a line. A man who had done no wrong. Pa man who had worked quietly and faithfully for years had been dismissed like garbage. It wasn't justice, it was cruelty. Though nobody said it aloud, the injustice burned in their hearts. Harris finally removed his gloves, placed them carefully on the cart, and took a deep breath. His face remained calm, but inside him stirred a quiet storm, not of anger, but of resolve. He had faced situations in his life where authority figures had abused power, where lives had been endangered by arrogance. In those moments, he had learned something valuable. Arrogance always led to downfall. One of the employees, a young intern named Daniel, couldn't hold back. He approached Harris nervously and whispered, "Sir, I'm so sorry. You don't deserve this." Harris gave him a small smile, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry about me," he said softly. "Take care of yourself." His voice carried no bitterness, no resentment, just quiet strength. Daniel was surprised. Most people, when fired unfairly, lashed out, cursed, or broke down. But Harris was different. It was as if he had already accepted what had happened, as though he had faced far worse in his life and had long ago learned not to let insults control him. By midday, the news had spread across the building. Harris had been fired. Some employees shook their heads in disbelief. Some expressed anger in hushed tones, and a few even shed tears. Harris had never been loud, never sought attention, but his presence had meant more to them than they realized. He was the quiet helper, the steady hand, the kind smile in a place full of pressure and fear. Losing him felt wrong, unfair, and deeply unsettling. Richard, however, felt none of this. In his corner office, he boasted to one of his senior managers about keeping standards high. The manager nodded silently, hiding his discomfort. Richard thought he had proven his strength. In reality, he had only revealed his weakness. The inability to see value in people beyond their job titles. For Harris, walking out of the building was not a moment of shame. He didn't lower his head or hurry past the stares of employees. Instead, he walked steadily, with the same calm steps he had taken every day to work. His dignity remained intact, untouched by Richard's cruelty. If anything, his quiet strength seemed brighter now, standing in stark contrast to the CEO's arrogance. But there was something Richard had not considered at all. Harris was not just a janitor. He was a man with a history, one that involved discipline, honor, and battles that Richard could never imagine. To underestimate such a man was not just foolish, it was dangerous. The unjust firing was meant to show the employees that Richard was in control. Instead, it had planted the seeds of doubt in their minds. Seeds that whispered, if this could happen to Harris, what about us? Seeds that quietly said, maybe power doesn't belong to the one shouting the loudest, but to the one who stays strong in silence. And for Harris, this was not the end of a chapter, was only the beginning of a story Richard would soon regret writing. The day after Harris was fired, the office felt different. The hallways were unusually quiet, as if the energy of the place had dimmed. People still typed away on keyboards and attended meetings, but the usual rhythm of the office was broken. Conversations that normally revolved around deadlines and projects now circled around one thing: Mr. Harris. Did you see how calm he was? One employee whispered in the break room. He didn't even argue. Another added, it's like he wasn't afraid at all. And the way he looked at the CEO, it's almost like he knew something Richard didn't. What began as small whispers soon grew into louder discussions. People who had barely spoken to Harris before began sharing little stories about him. A secretary recalled how he had fixed her car battery in the parking lot one winter evening. A delivery driver mentioned how Harris had once stopped a thief from running away with packages outside the building. The stories painted a picture of a man who wasn't just a janitor, he was someone who carried quiet strength and sharp instincts. Then came the real discovery. One of the HR's assistants, curious after hearing so many unusual stories, decided to look deeper into Harris's background. What she found left her speechless. Hidden within his employment file were details most people never knew. His full name was James Harris, and before taking up the job as a janitor, he had spent over 20 years serving in the military. Not just any military unit, he had been part of the Special Forces, a decorated operative who had received medals of honor for missions that were classified even to this day. The HR assistant couldn't believe it. She showed the records to a close colleague, and soon the news spread quietly through the office like wildfire. The janitor they had all ignored for years had once been a soldier who risked his life for the country. He had been trained in survival, strategy, and combat. He had led men through dangerous missions, faced enemies that most people only saw in movies, and returned home with scars that told stories he never shared. The employees' respect for Harris grew tenfold overnight. They realized why he always carried himself with such calm discipline. His steady movements, his sharp eyes, his ability to react instantly in emergencies, all of it now made sense. He hadn't been just an ordinary worker cleaning floors. He had been a warrior who chose a quieter life after years of sacrifice. Meanwhile, Richard remained completely unaware of the revelation. He sat in his corner office, feeling proud of himself for maintaining authority. To him, Harris was already forgotten, just another disposable worker thrown out for failing to meet his impossible standards. But for the staff, the truth about Harris became a secret bond. In hushed voices, they spoke of him not as a janitor, but as a man of honor who had endured far greater challenges than the arrogance of one CEO. One evening, a group of employees gathered in the parking lot, still talking about the revelation. Daniel, the young intern who had spoken to Harris before he left, shared something the others didn't know. You know, when I told him I was sorry, he looked at me like he'd seen this all before. Told me not to worry about him, to just take care of myself. It wasn't the voice of someone afraid of losing a job. It was the voice of someone who had already faced life and death. The employees nodded, some with tears in their eyes. For the first time, they realized how deeply wrong Richard's arrogance had been. He hadn't just fired a janitor. He had disrespected a man who had given everything for his country. A man who deserved honor, not humiliation. By the end of the week, the whispers had spread beyond the office walls. A local newspaper picked up the story after a former colleague of Harris, retired soldier, happened to hear about his firing. The article described Harris as a decorated Special Forces operative who had chosen a humble life after retirement. It didn't mention the CEO by name. But those who knew the story could easily connect the dots. When copies of the article began appearing around the office, people passed them quietly from desk to desk. Some printed it out, some saved it on their phones, and others even left copies in the break room. The truth could no longer be hidden. The man their CEO had insulted and discarded was far more honorable than the man who had fired him. Richard discovered the article 3 days later when a senior manager nervously placed it on his desk. At first, Richard scoffed, brushing it off as irrelevant. But as he read further, his face grew pale. Every line of the article revealed a part of Harris's past, his missions, his medals, his years of service. The man he had called pathetic had once commanded respect from generals, saved lives under fire, and stood unshaken in the face of real danger. For the first time in years, Richard felt something unusual: shame. His arrogance had blinded him, and now the entire company knew it. He had treated a hero like dirt, and everyone was watching to see what he would do next. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Harris's calm eyes staring back at him, unbroken even as he was fired. He realized now why those eyes had felt different. They were not the eyes of a defeated man. They were the eyes of someone who had already lived through battles far greater than corporate arrogance. And while Richard wrestled with guilt and fear, Harris lived his quiet life outside the office, never boasting about his past, never seeking revenge. But the truth was out now, and the balance of respect inside the company had shifted forever. The janitor was gone, but his story remained, whispered like a legend. And Richard knew deep down that this was only the beginning of the consequences he would face. Richard Collins sat in his office the following Monday morning, sipping an expensive coffee and flipping through paperwork with his usual arrogance. For him, the weekend had been filled with golf, fine dining, and self-congratulation. In his mind, firing the janitor had been nothing more than a display of strength, a necessary reminder to his employees that he demanded perfection. He believed the matter was closed, forgotten by everyone except Harris himself. But Richard's illusion of control was about to crack as he scanned the latest financial reports. His assistant walked in nervously, clutching a folded newspaper. She placed it on his desk without a word. Richard glanced at her impatiently. "What is this? Another article about our quarterly performance?" The assistant swallowed hard. I think you should read it, sir." Richard frowned but unfolded the paper. His eyes landed on the headline, "From Battlefield to Broom. Local war hero lives quietly." After years in Special Forces, his heart gave a sudden jolt, though he tried not to show it. He read on. The article told the story of James Harris, decorated soldier, retired Special Forces operative, and humble janitor. It spoke of covert missions, acts of bravery, medals earned through blood and sacrifice. It described a man who had risked his life countless times, who had saved comrades in the line of fire, who had chosen a quiet and simple life after service. Each sentence was like a blow to Richard's chest. His arrogant dismissal of Harris now looked monstrous in comparison. The man he had humiliated in front of dozens of employees wasn't just a janitor. He was a hero. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he lowered the paper. For the first time in years, he felt small. His assistant stood quietly, waiting for his reaction. "Where did this come from?" he demanded, his voice harsher than intended. "It's everywhere," she replied softly. "The staff has already seen it. Some of them printed copies. It's spreading fast." Richard's jaw tightened. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city skyline. For a moment, he imagined Harris out there, living his quiet life completely unconcerned with what Richard thought of him. That calm stare from the lobby came back to Richard's mind, steady, unwavering, almost intimidating in its silence. Now he understood why. Those weren't the eyes of a broken man. They were the eyes of someone who had already faced far greater battles and survived. Inside the office, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Employees whispered in corners, their respect for Harris now magnified by the truth of his past. They shared stories with pride, calling him Mr. Harris with newfound reverence. The man who had been invisible was now unforgettable. And with every whispered word, Richard's authority crumbled a little more. Richard tried to regain control. He called a meeting with his senior managers, hoping to reassert his dominance. But as he stood at the head of the table, explaining strategies and targets, he felt their eyes on him not with fear, but with quiet judgment. He could sense it. They were no longer impressed by his expensive suit or his loud voice. In their minds, the comparison was unavoidable. The arrogant CEO versus the humble hero. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his luxurious bed, staring at the ceiling. The newspaper article lay on the nightstand, but the real problem was in his memory. Harris's calm eyes haunted him. Richard replayed the scene in the lobby again and again, his own voice loud and cruel. Harris's silence, steady and strong. He realized now that in that moment, Harris hadn't looked weak, he had looked powerful. In a way Richard could never understand. For the first time, Richard wondered if power wasn't about shouting the loudest, but about staying calm when shouted at. He hated the thought, yet he couldn't shake it. By midweek, the pressure grew. A few employees had anonymously posted about the incident on social media. The posts didn't name Richard directly, but they described a wealthy CEO who fired a war hero janitor. The story spread quickly, gaining sympathy and outrage. Richard's phone buzzed constantly with calls from board members demanding explanations. His polished image as a strong leader was beginning to crack in public. He tried to justify himself, telling colleagues that he hadn't known Harris's background. "How could I have known?" he insisted, but even as he said it, he felt the hollowness of the excuse. Ignorance was no defense against arrogance. The board was furious. "You've humiliated the company," one member told him bluntly. "Do you realize what this looks like? You threw away a man who served this country as if he were trash. The media doesn't care about your intentions. They care about the story." For once, Richard had no clever response. He sat in silence, realizing that the control he had clung to so tightly was slipping away. Meanwhile, Harris remained silent, refusing interviews, declining invitations to tell his story. That only made him more respected. His refusal to seek attention painted him as even more honorable. While Richard's name grew darker with each passing day, at his desk late one evening, Richard finally admitted to himself the truth he had fought to ignore. In firing Harris, he had revealed his own weakness, not Harris's. Harris had lost a job, but Richard had lost respect. The one currency a leader could never afford to squander. The arrogance that had once defined Richard now felt like a weight, dragging him down, and though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning. Harris's past had been revealed, and with it, Richard's downfall had truly begun. The office no longer felt like the same place it had been just a week ago. The energy in the air had changed. Once, people kept their heads down, working in silence, fearing the heavy footsteps of the CEO. Now, whispers of Harris's past flowed through every corridor, and the weight of Richard's authority had grown lighter. Weaker, almost laughable to some. The employees still followed orders, still met deadlines, but something was different in their eyes. When Richard spoke, they no longer saw a man of power, they saw a man who had humiliated a hero. The contrast was too great to ignore. Richard had money, a title, and authority on paper. Harris had none of that. Yet in silence, he commanded. A respect that Richard could never buy. At first, Richard tried to deny what was happening. He doubled down on his arrogance, raising his voice even more in meetings, nitpicking over small mistakes, and making dramatic speeches about discipline and excellence. But it didn't work the way it used to. The fear was gone. Employees did not flinch as much. They listened, but behind their eyes was a quiet resistance. One morning, Richard stormed into a staff meeting late, as he often did, expecting everyone to freeze. Instead, the room carried on in a low hum of conversation until he loudly cleared his throat. The silence that followed wasn't respect, it was cold, strained. Like people had given up caring. He presented new targets, barking orders. As usual, but he noticed something that unsettled him. People were exchanging glances, as if silently judging every word. And when the meeting ended, he overheard two junior employees muttering in the hallway. "Can you believe he fired Harris?" One whispered, "Yeah." The other replied, "The man fought for this country, and Richard treated him worse than trash." Some leader, Richard's stomach twisted with unease. For the first time, his own employees were openly mocking him, but the real lesson in respect came a few days later. A charity organization reached out to the company, inviting them to sponsor a veterans event. Normally, Richard would have brushed it aside, too busy flaunting his wealth to care about causes. But after the scandal, he felt pressure from the board to attend. The event was being held in a community hall nearby, and the company's presence was expected. Richard arrived, dressed in his finest suit, with a camera crew capturing every moment. He shook hands, smiled stiffly, and tried to act as though he cared. But as he scanned the room, his eyes froze. Standing among the veterans, surrounded by people greeting him with warmth and admiration, was Harris. The humble janitor, now revealed as a decorated soldier, stood taller than ever. He wore no suit, just simple clothes, but the respect he commanded in that room was undeniable. Veterans approached him, clapping him on the back, thanking him for his service. Younger soldiers looked at him with admiration, hanging on his every word. He didn't boast, didn't brag. He simply listened, smiled, and shared quiet advice when asked. Richard felt a pang of something he had never felt before. Envy. Not envy of money or status, he already had those. But envy of true respect. Harris had it without trying, while Richard, despite all his wealth and titles, had lost it. During the speeches, the host took a moment to honor Harris publicly. They spoke of his missions, his courage, his sacrifices. The audience rose to their feet in applause, clapping loudly, some even whistling in admiration. Harris nodded humbly, his eyes lowered, as though uncomfortable with the attention. Richard clapped along, but his hands felt heavy. He knew everyone in the room could see the irony. The arrogant CEO who fired a war hero now, forced to applaud him. Some people even glanced at Richard with disapproval, shaking their heads subtly. After the event, Richard considered approaching Harris. He rehearsed words in his mind: an apology, perhaps, or some excuse. But when he finally walked toward him, Harris turned, and their eyes met. That same calm gaze, steady and unreadable, cut through Richard like a blade. For a brief second, Richard felt like a child caught misbehaving. He wanted to explain himself, to justify what he had done, but the words caught in his throat. Gave him a polite nod. Nothing more, and turned back to speak with another veteran. That single gesture spoke louder than any insult. Harris didn't need to humiliate Richard. His silence was enough. Back at the office, the shift grew even clearer. Employees began to use Harris's story as a quiet rallying point. They spoke openly about the importance of respect, about dignity, about how leadership wasn't about shouting, but about serving. Some even started joking that Harris, the janitor, had shown more leadership in silence than Richard ever had with all his speeches. Richard tried everything to regain control: lavish office parties, bonus incentives, even public speeches about valuing every worker. But the damage was done. The respect he had lost was gone for good. His words sounded hollow because people remembered the truth. Respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned, and in that lesson, Richard was finally forced to face himself. His arrogance had built walls between him and his employees, but Harris's humility had built bridges without effort. That was the difference. That was leadership. For Richard, it was too late. The lesson had come at the cost of his reputation, his credibility, and his dignity. For Harris, it was simply another chapter in a life of honor, reminder that true respect is never taken by force. It is given freely to those who deserve it.